welcome to this special Mint Extra, looking at the pre-budget situation in Zimbabwe. Now, the 14th of November 2019 is an important date in the economic calendar of Zimbabwe. It is a day on which the Minister of Finance, Professor Xtra, submits his 2020 budget to Parliament for consideration. Now, Minister Xtra's budget is expected to focus on measures that will lessen the burden and pain of the government's austerity measures, which the country has suffered for much of 2019. The biggest issues that ordinary Zimbabweans faced ranged from rampant price increases of basic commodities, galloping inflation, and stagnant wages as the economy adjusted to the new economic order. Now, today in the studio, we are joined by our guest, Chris Mugaga, Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, and Happiness Ngeni, former editor of the Business Times, to get their views on what we should expect to come out of the Minister's budget presentation. The biggest issues that ordinary Zimbabweans faced ranged from rampant price increases of basic commodities, galloping inflation, and stagnant wages as the economy adjusted to the new economic order. So, what do you think the minister can do to alleviate the hardships being currently felt by ordinary Zimbabweans in his budget?
But obviously, if I was Professor Xtra, the first option is honest to the public, that we are in for a long haul. It's not easy. Secondly, I think the twin evils of volatility of exchange rate, the inflation we're talking about, are a reality. So to think growth, when already, if you look at the forecast, most people have a tendency of looking at the budget in isolation of the 2019 budget. 2019, there was talk about year-end having a budget deficit below 5% to GDP. You're looking at the range of the exchange rate of
economic growth is over 3% when we're actually
economic
at
growth,
6.5.
which I know is definitely, possibly we're even quite very nice to say 6%. The growth, GDP growth numbers for the year could be negative, even 10%,
negative,
double digit.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult call for the minister.
Yeah, let me ask you this, because you made a very good point there. Look, at the end of the day, the 2% tax is here to stay. That's very clear. The minister reiterated that when he briefed journalists the other day, and that covers most of the informal sector. But if he wants to put in place measures that affect ordinary people, and he's looking at taxes, that doesn't include the informal sector, because most of them are actually only paying taxes to the 2% tax. They're not formally taxed. So really, any measures he takes, is that not really aimed at more the formal employees rather than actually the biggest market, which is the informal sector? Happiness.
But we really haven't defined the informal sector in Zimbabwe. If we're talking hair salons, they actually pay presumptive tax, and combis, they also pay presumptive tax plus the 2%. So I think we need to really define the informal sector to say, who is it? Is it the airtime vendor? But that's not the informal sector.
That's not the informal sector.
Just someone who's trying to survive, and who really is the informal sector that we're targeting with this 2%. On the 2%, I think, yes, it's here to stay. He's actually said it's here to stay. But then there's also triple taxation, double taxation. You're also paying payee, and then you're also being hit on the 2%. It would make sense for him to reduce payee, and then possibly then we just get taxed on the 2%.
The minister did hint that there may be tax cuts. So we're looking at that area of the budget that he gives to see whether he will be able to give some form of relief to the pockets of ordinary people. But I think the tools that he has are not, he hasn't got a lot of tools in his armory there. Let's get to inflation. You talked about that. You know, these are numbers given by the Bankers Association of Zimbabwe. They estimated that inflation for August 2019 was 288.6%, up from 175.6% in June. That's their numbers. Of course, we get all sorts of different numbers being touted around, and I think that if you asked a man on the street, they would say inflation is much higher, just looking at the price increases between, say, June and now. But what measures can he really do, Chris, to try and bring inflation under control, or at least to start bringing it into manageable levels, because that has a direct impact on the exchange rate as well?
I think it's basic. It should be basic knowledge that when you talk inflation, it's a monetary phenomenon. You can track the growth inflation numbers of Zimbabwe to clear broad money supply. Just now you're talking about agriculture, a smart way of command agriculture. Just looking at figures 2017, 2018, look at the government spending 230 year-on-year just on command agriculture. And I'm quite very afraid right now, as rain season comes, to what extent is the smart command agriculture going to solve a problem? Because already I think government remains the guarantor, which means when you guarantee something, you continue taking the risk. Any failure, default, government will take it as expenditure. So to solve the inflation problems, obviously, I think as private sector, we've spoken about the issue of independence of central bank itself. Because what we're having at the moment is a case where even inflation numbers, when they are coming, there's no confidence. Who will accept that inflation numbers
Well,
are what
interestingly
they're
enough, we directly asked the minister last week. In fact, I asked him directly, would you support an independent central bank? And the response was, they already are independent. And if you put in place a monetary policy committee, there's no need for us to do that because they are independent with the MPC.
It depends.
And there's no
It depends.
control. So
it depends
it's an interesting view again, you know.
I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. But the independence of central bank, obviously, it's a subject which we think all the treasury bills, all the financing of the budget deficit through the bank overdraft of the central bank, it's a clear testimony that you can't define independence in any sense of it. Yeah. I think that's one issue. Secondly, I raised the issue of broad money supply. I think the unusual and health appetite of this government to continue spending. During the time of Gono, we printed ourselves into inflation into the US dollar then came Manguja. In between, remember there was diabetes, inclusive government. Then we printed ourselves again. Now we're out of what? Of dollarization.
But we're not printing, I hope, with a bit of that.
But if you look at the broad money supply, they can dispute the figures June, July, August. You're looking at figures of averaging around 11, 12 billion. Adjusted for revaluation losses, maybe you can just talk of 2-3 billion on that. So the broad money supply trend, naturally, it has been growing. And it's for the government through the central bank to prove to all and sundry that no, look, austerity had come. Even the debate right now after the introduction of the new notes and coins, the fear of people is not that they don't accept that it's not inflationary simply because you're just substituting the electronic balancing at cash. It's the tendency, the gargantuan appetite of this government to spend beyond what
you make a great point here, Happiness. This is about confidence. And it appears that there seems to be a deficit of confidence between what policymakers are doing and saying, whatever good intentions they have, and what the people on the street believe.
Well, yeah, people have been hit. Like, they've gone through this episode before in 2008, and now it's just coming back to them again. So obviously confidence levels are low. And then we were made to believe that once we introduced the bond notes, things are going to be fine. In 2016, then things went west, the rates started going up. And then come October last year, things just kind of went haywire. I mean, if you're to even calculate, if you're to believe the true inflation that we have in Zimbabwe, what you were buying for $1 last year is now 14, which is 1,400% increase. So that's where the levels of inflation are. And if you're to check the company internal checks, there are a lot of companies, big companies, that are saying that the internal inflation is around 1,000% now. So this is where we are. People are not going to be confident. It will take time. Look, we're not the first country to go through this. We probably are the first country to go through two bouts of hyperinflation. But certainly, it will take time for people to regain confidence.
Let's talk about government expenditure. You know, the minister is touted. He says it often, as does the permanent secretary, that Zimbabwe's budget has a budget surplus, and in fact, it's gone up all the way to August. But he doesn't believe that the surplus will last, and by the end of the year, it will be in deficit. But in fact, you asked a very good question the other day, Happiness. You said, how do you think the minister intends to finance the budget deficit, which by all accounts could be upwards of $3 to $5 billion? And what did he say? What was his response?
His response was, we've already funded the budget. But obviously those are, like what he actually says, those are accounting deficits. Obviously in this hyperinflation, the figures don't make sense anyway. He's already said he's funded. We've seen them issuing TBs to finance government programs. Yesterday, 300 million TBs were taken up. So that's how they're funding it. And that's money supply that he's talking about, that's being created right in front of our eyes.
I had an interesting comment the other day in the sense that they are revaluing on offshore balances, and that's one reason why money supply is going up. Because, of course, if you revalue it to the interbank exchange rate, you're always going to have a constant growth of money supply, even though there's no real physical cash entering into the economy.
Maybe didn't get, I said, when you do an analysis of broad money supply, you have to adjust for evaluation losses.
Got you.
And after considering those figures, you can
still-
still see that
You can still see because you can extrapolate
Yeah.
the
You see.
revaluation and then you
The-
can, yeah.
you
You
can't-
still see there
you
is
can't use
growth,
Yeah, you can see.
but no one is really explaining where is the growth in money
see?
supply coming from.
Yeah,
In
but the
fact,
same applies also to inflation.
Right.
I think it's quite a bad move when you see the minister suspending inflation figures to say, no, look, yesterday, same time we're using a US dollar. I mean, look, the market is quite very clear. There's no information asymmetry regarding what currency we're using same time last year, which is the reason why suspending inflation numbers even to claim that, no, we can't compare because there was no using dollar. It's bad.
now,
economics.
you did talk about command agriculture, and interestingly enough, the minister again alluded to this 2 weeks ago in the sense of a bit of a tweak to the way command agriculture was done. Instead of being directly through government, he wants to bring in some form of guarantee model, a new way of doing agriculture, bringing in private sector. Having it sounds like a good idea in the sense of trying to remove the risk, but as we asked the minister, surely by guaranteeing command agriculture, you're kind of putting contingent liability on your books.
Yeah. Command agriculture, yes. On paper, it does make sense, but we really need to reevaluate ourselves as a country. We've been putting money in agriculture since independence, and we've been subsidizing agriculture since independence. What has come out of it? What value has come out of it? Of course, it allows your granny to grow maize and to get free inputs from maize, and that's it, to feed yourself. But as a country, is that aiding our economy? Yes, it's a good political tool, but at this point, we really need to see what value is coming out of these things. Should we continue pouring money into that? 900 million has already gone to presidential inputs already for free seed, free fertilizer. More is going to go to command agriculture. Are we maize growers in Zimbabwe? Our yields, what are our average yields per hectare? That's like 0.9 tons per hectare, when in fact we should be doing 9 to 10 tons a hectare. We are very low, and yet we continue to do that. And your requirement for command is what? You just have to have irrigation on your farm. Never mind if you're a good
Water and
farmer.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, command is here to stay. There's no doubt about
Yeah.
that. So we can expect the minister to at least probably increase the budget, but put in place a new, what we call a new framework for command agriculture, trying to use the private sector to help fund it rather than directly through government. Now, one area that really does concern Zimbabweans is the health sector. And it's clear that the minister obviously has to throw a bit of money at the health sector, not just for drugs and medicine, but also for such issues as possibly looking at the doctor's wages, I think are unbudgeted for. But is there more you can do rather than just throwing money at the health sector?
A trend analysis of the social safety nets contribution, I think you see how the non-government organizations have been quite very handy in supporting the social service, can I call it. I don't think we need to debate an allocative budget, given that already whatever size of this $0 budget it is so uncertain to the extent that an outlook in terms of exchange rate, it scares. But then the next question is, so to what extent can government try to assist the health sector outside the budgetary support,
Right.
which is the national budgetary? Obviously, I think with countries, some of them from the West, some maybe the selected countries from Africa, we had helped quite a lot in terms of helping social safety nets. In a country where poverty levels are beyond 80%, can I consider it that way? In a country where informal sector dominates, the tax to GDP ratio for Zimbabwe, you're talking of plus 22%. So continuously talking of taxing him or her in order to raise money, either to allocate towards say, health or what, it's a disaster already.
No, so, it moved to the health tax, was
so
at some
for
point,
the
if I
health,
recall.
for the health sector,
It's there on the airtime.
It's there on the
it's there on the airtime. But regardless, I think when the debate comes, I don't understand the language of an allocated budget where people continue talking about how much should be given to this. I think we should go beyond that. For this budget, the biggest relief, either any tax-wise or any manner, is stability. Because we don't see stability. After this national budget, there's even worry to say, will the rate respond? And unfortunately, when the rate responds, it doesn't respond southwards. You know the direction it takes. So social safety nets, government can only do that through avoiding printing money. Secondly, I think she's talking about command, the smart agriculture command. They call it smart now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Presidential input scheme is already enough to support through the budgetary means. Command, at the meeting I spoke to the Bankers Association, they are saying up to date, year to date, supporting agriculture to the tune of plus 2 billion.
Already up
2
to
billion.
date.
So when the debate comes about command agriculture, then you try to factor in the yields since it was introduced, or the yields are from 1999-2000 land reform. I think you can see Professor Mtuli and his government, part of the government, is shunning, avoiding the land security, land tenure argument, which has to be solved. And now they are going a bit about the bush, trying to solve it through command. Land is an asset, it has to be bankable.
Well, apparently with the smart command, it gets rid of this business of 99-year leases, which banks were saying that they may not accept for security. But apparently the minister thinks that his plan will bring those 99 leases back into play and banks will be able to use them as securitization. Anyway, let's talk about two more issues before we wind up, because there's so much in the budget that we can talk about. I always tell you this, we could talk for hours about the budget and what's going to happen. And there's going to be more programming, of course, because obviously there's a build-up to the budget. And of course, we have the budget itself here live on ZTN. You can watch it on our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, and of course our website, ztn.co.zw. And of course, The Chase is on to talk about what impact the budget will have on ordinary people. Let's talk about just two issues very quickly. Wages. You know, the minister once was quoted as saying he's surprised that employees haven't hit the streets against their employers to talk about wages. Of course, he pulled that back pretty quickly. But I think the point he was trying to make, and I think Chris as well does happiness, if you just give us a quick comment, he's saying that he doesn't understand why employers can actually put in quite large profits. Because if you look at some of the profits coming in from the corporate sector, they're quite good. But employee wages have remained pretty stagnant. Because now, of course, you represent business to a certain degree, Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce. On the other side, of course, that's private sector. On the other side, the minister is saying that he can't pay civil servants inflation and exchange rate linked wages, of course, because they can't afford it. So let's talk about, maybe you can talk about the private sector and happens, you can talk about the civil servant side. What is it about employers and paying wages? Do you think there's any room for employers to pay wages? Anything that the minister can do in his budget that may give more disposable income for employers to be able to give to employees?
Obviously, when you look at what we call the disposable income level to GDP, one of the major drivers of GDP growth is spending, generally. But with depressed spending like we have in this country at the moment, it's a panacea for a disaster going forward. Private sector position, I think you appreciate we are operating in darkness. 18 hours of no electricity should confirm to you that the bill on energy alone eclipses another bill. Years back, we used to have a dominant wage bill, being the bigger cost on the expenditure side. For most organizations, if you look at the cost-income ratio, you'll see how the wage salary was an issue. But for private sector, I think we need to thank God that they still continue opening. Post 2019 to 2020, normally the proverbial shutdown period, coming back in 2020, it might not be easy for a lot of companies. Electricity challenges, forex challenges, the interbank market has not been delivering. So to talk about the wage adjustments, I think companies are doing it privately, but it's not a priority.
But it then follows, though, that companies can hopefully introduce wage increases if some of the other macro and microeconomic issues are dealt with. You talked about electricity. If electricity was there and it was at least the exchange rate was a bit more stable and so on, and social net. So possibly the other policy pronouncement the minister may help.
It's a macroeconomic issue where a company is not
right.
And it's also important to correct a misconception that companies are posting. I'm seeing companies, either the quoted companies, or you look at even, I think recently we saw numbers from Deloitte, one of the possibly 4 years blue chip counter. It's reflective of what's happening.
And of course, inflation, if you're inflation adjusted, they suddenly become a little bit different.
And the consumers can no longer take it. These taxes or what? So it's a response by consumers to say we can't continue.
Happiness, we've talked private sector. Let's talk civil servants, because obviously there's huge pressures coming in the civil servants for salary increase. And the minister was clear. He said that he wants to look after salaries for the army in particular and the police, I think he mentioned. And he also was very keen about the health sector. But the pressure for wage increases is coming through civil servants. We've seen in the last couple of weeks. Yet the government cannot pay exchange rate.
They cannot pay because it's a function of what they get. How does government make money? They make money from revenues from the private sector, tax revenues. So if that's very constrained, then they'll be also constrained to be able to give these salary increases. But I think for his part, what he needs to do is to look at retrenchment, to be honest. I mean, cut the civil
You talked about the
service.
biometric coming online, didn't you?
Well, that will just eliminate ghost workers. But like he said, it's also very difficult to identify ghost workers because you can just be a relative of somebody and then actually go for biometrics and go through
And then go home.
and go home and still get your money. So it's going to be very difficult. So what he needs to do is just to reduce
He needs
the
to trim the
headcount.
civil servants,
He needs to trim the civil servants. But as government also, there's need for balance. You need to also employ because government is the largest employer. So he's actually constrained in terms of what he can
But maybe
do.
he can put in place more non-monetary benefits, things like housing, transportation, maybe to increase that a bit more. I don't know. But he has to do something, correct? Because otherwise the pressure will continue.
But like Hip is mentioning, it's interesting. There's something I looked at one point, trying to understand the headcount, just doing an analysis of the headcount of civil servants over 4 or 5 years. Yes, on paper they look so many. But if you look at what's been driving, especially the wage salary aspect, it's allowances.
Yeah.
They
Travel.
almost constitute 40% of the whole wage bill.
Allowances.
Then secondly, I don't know, because we have a top-heavy system. Right now, I think His Excellency has appointed quite a number of deputy ministers. I personally think we don't need so many deputy ministers.
I think one issue, of course,
These
was
are
do
the
we have
issues
too
we-
many ministries? But anyway, I think that's a discussion,
We have
not
to
for
balance with
the
politics.
budget. Yeah, that's not for the budget and it's not for the minister tomorrow. But look, let's wrap up, unfortunately. Let's talk about job creation because we're moving to that stage where, and it's one of the government's major priorities is creating jobs. And because I think this also plays into your members. They want to target more formal jobs through a combination of incentives and lines of credit and stimulating growth in the agriculture and manufacturing sectors. And some of these measures will be announced in the budget. Of course, the one thing I say as an aside is that the budget, it requires that we have a very good agricultural season. I think that's one of the problems that we have. It does. It requires that the agricultural season hit our last budget in 2019 quite hard, as in Cyclone Idai as well. But we need a good agricultural season for this budget to actually work, which I hope it does.
Why do we need a good agricultural
Well, this is what he said
season?
himself, didn't he? He said he needed a good agricultural season for his numbers.
Okay, but how much has agriculture been contributing to GDP?
Well, last year it wasn't so good. In fact, it was a minus to all the
No,
imports
how
coming
much?
in.
Even historically or otherwise, we should check our numbers. Agriculture has never been the biggest contributor to GDP. It's always been manufacturing and mining.
So let's talk
why
about
are
jobs
we-
in those sectors then, because they want to create jobs. They're going to be policy announcements made. I'm not sure what policy announcement you can make to create jobs. I think a lot of countries do use infrastructure to create jobs. The USA is a good example. In fact, after the Depression, they put a huge infrastructure program in and it boosted the economy because it created work, basically. That's not feasible.
Okay, what I'm expecting is an incentive. Let's say a youth employment incentive so that you get the youth in jobs. So who will have to do that to companies. Whoever will then employ youths will then be exempted from tax or anything. I think that's going to come up. Creating
Entrepreneurship
jobs,
programs, I
like
suppose.
I've always said, do we really know what we want to do? It's easy that you say let's create jobs and then set up something, but is it going to work? Is it going to bring value to the economy?
That's a very good point, and I think it's a good point to leave on, because the fact is this: most economies now are moving more to high tech, and they're moving away from what we call traditional jobs. And they're
Do we
moving
even
into
have an ICT policy?
Well, these are some
to
of the
say
issues that, well, you can see from this discussion, there's a lot that the minister is going to have to come up with in his budget presentation. I think I'd like to thank our guest, Happiness Ngeni, former editor of the Business Times, and of course, Chris Mugaga, CEO of Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on Mint Extra. It is safe to say, however, that the Budget 2020 presentation is one of the most important in Zimbabwe's history. What is left to see is how the Minister of Finance, Professor Ngube, will be able to satisfy all the competing pressures in the economy and maintain a new non-austerity growth budget. We look forward to his presentation with great anticipation. Tune into ZTN via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, our website, ztn.co.zw, and keep your Twitter comments coming via our handle @ZTN News. Our budget build-up coverage starts at 1:30 p.m. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye and be safe.